Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight and for participating in our first workshop for the proposed amendments to District Rules 2201, our new and modified stationary source review rule, and District Rule 2301, our emission reduction credit banking rule or ERC banking rule. My name is Errol Villegas. I am a permit services manager here in the Fresno office. To my left, I have Brian Clerico, a supervising air quality engineer. And then to his left, I have Jesse Garcia, one of our senior air quality engineers. This meeting is being held via Zoom video teleconference and is being recorded, and we'll do our best to facilitate a smooth meeting. Before I begin, I wanted to review some general information and instructions for the meeting. First off, if you can please silence your other communication devices, such as your mobile or your desk phones, to ensure that we are not hearing any feedback that can interrupt the meeting. During the meeting, we will open up at various times throughout the presentation and at the end of the presentation for public comments and questions. However, if you do happen to have any questions at any point during the presentation, please make yourself known and we'll do our best to try to answer your question at that time. For those members of the public participating via Zoom, please press the raise hand function or button so you may be recognized to speak. For those participating via teleconference, please press *9 to raise your hand to be recognized to speak. For those, again, on teleconference, staff will call the last 4 digits of your phone number when it's your turn to speak, and then use the *6 button to mute and or unmute yourself. We also have an option to receive comments via email, and you can send those comments and questions anytime during the presentation. That email will show up on the presentation. It is webcast@valleyair.org. And through the comment periods, I will review the email and then read those for our ability to respond. So that concludes my opening remarks. What I will do is I will ask that we get the presentation up on the screen and pass it off to Jesse Garcia to begin the presentation portion.
All right, good evening, everyone. Once again, I'm Jesse Garcia, a senior air quality engineer in the Permit Services Department. In today's workshop, we'll be presenting the proposed amendments for Rule 2201 and Rule 2301, as Errol had mentioned. I'll be providing the first part of today's presentation for the workshop on 2201, and then I'll hand it over to Brian to present on 2301. And maybe in the middle of that transition, we'll stop and see if there's any comments. So in today's presentation, we'll be covering the principal amendments being proposed today for Rules 2201 and 2301. The 2201 amendments to be discussed are federal offset equivalency demonstration, offsetting requirements, and then other potential amendments. And for 2301 amendments that Brian will cover, those will be application timeliness, definition of shutdown, and other potential amendments there for Rule 2301. Here's an overview of the topics we'll be covering for 2201, which are outlined in the red dashed line. The other topics we know we'll be discussing in future workshops are in the boxes outlined with a solid black line. If there are any topics that need to be presented at a workshop, they may be added to this diagram. So at this point, this overview of topics is not necessarily a comprehensive list. You'll see in the left, in the orangish color, we'll discuss the district's multi-path approach for offsetting requirements, in which we'll have a path for NOx and VOC and a different path for the other pollutants. If we move on to the next column in blue, we'll be discussing the district's federal offset equivalency demonstration and how we'll remove NOx and VOC from it. And the demonstration will be a single test. And then lastly, shown in the dark blue, we'll be discussing provisions for using pre-project potentials to emit and offset calculations while we propose to adopt federal offsetting for NOx and VOC for federal major modifications and new major sources. You'll also see that there are other topics that will need to be covered in the future. And then an overview for the Rule 2301 topics. Brian will cover the district's proposed amendments to the shutdown definition to ensure consistency in that all ERC applications are submitted in a timely manner. And we'll also cover the proposed amendments in regards to new greenhouse gas banking. With that being said, we're going to begin with the proposed amendments to Rule 2201, which is also known as the New Source Review Rule, or NSR. For the path moving forward, the district is proposing to use a multi-path approach for offsetting requirements, with a path for NOx and VOC, and then a separate path for PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO requirements. The path for NOx and VOC emissions would be to integrate the federal offsetting program into Rule 2201, which is consistent with the current requirements and equivalency remedies in place. For new major sources and federal major modifications, we will require the federal offset quantity to be provided, and the federal offset quantities are to be satisfied with ERCs that are surplus at time of use. For all other ATC projects, we'll require the district offset quantity, and the district offset quantity may be satisfied with any valid ERC. And this is consistent with state law and historic California Air District practice. And lastly, for this path, the district would no longer need to track projects that require NOx and VOC offsets for the offset equivalency system. The other part of the multi-path approach for PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO is a little more straightforward in that it follows the district's current offsetting procedures. For all ATC projects, the district would require the district offset quantity, or the DOQ, and the DOQ may be satisfied with any valid ERC. And this is consistent with state law and historic California Air District practice. This path for these pollutants is still appropriate because programmatically, Rule 2201 offsetting requirements are more stringent than federal NSR offsetting requirements. As such, the district will continue to track and include these pollutants in the federal offset equivalency system to ensure that our requirements are at least as stringent as the federal program. Therefore, the offsetting requirements for these pollutants are not expected to change. For the federal offset equivalency tracking system, NOx and VOC will be removed going forward because the federal NSR offsetting requirements will be applied to new major sources and federal major modifications for NOx or VOC. And for PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO, those will remain in the tracking system. And then with that, we'll go ahead and present some draft rule language here on the next slide. And it's quite a bit of language there. But here in section 7 of the current NSR rule, we have some proposed concepts for amended rule language. In the first line, you'll see that the offset equivalency demonstration will only be done for PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO, while we maintain a tracking system for all pollutants for the ERC cap tracking, or the pre-baseline ERC cap tracking. The tracking system will track each of the following: the federal offset quantity and the district offset quantity. And we have started using those terms, the FOQ and the DOQ, and want to officially include those terms and definitions of those terms in our rule. And so since we are changing section 7.1.1 and 7.1.2 to definitions, we're proposing to remove existing additional language that does not support those definitions. And that's what we have shown here on this slide. So continuing on, the federal offset equivalency tracking system, as we have stated before, PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO will remain in the tracking system. And for those pollutants, the evaluation of equivalency will be based on one comprehensive test for each pollutant. This test will require that for all ATC projects issued during the tracking year, the district must be able to match the total federal offset quantity, or the FOQ, required for that pollutant with an equal amount of surplus emission reductions valued at time of use. This would be a version of what was historically called Test 2, or the surplus value test. And that was previously in section 7.2.2. And that is the appropriate measure of programmatic equivalency. And then the remedy for failure is implementation of the federal NSR offset system. And so here on the next slide, we'll see some draft rule language. So section 7.2.1 and 7.2.2 were previously informally known as Test 1 and Test 2, which made up a two-part test for demonstrating equivalency with the federal offsetting requirements. Here, we're proposing to change section 7.2.1 to require a compilation of the federal offset quantity and the district offset quantity that was actually required under this rule during the tracking period. And section 7.2.2 is being proposed to be the section for demonstrating equivalency with the federal offsetting requirements, in which the district will be required to compare the total federal offset quantity to the surplus value of the creditable reduction used as offsets during the year. And so this will be a single test of equivalency. And so now we'll discuss some of the other potential amendments to the district's NSR rule. The district is considering amendments to clarify which provisions may be utilized for NOx and VOC new major sources and federal major modifications consistent with federal offsetting requirements, which include exploring the amendment of the baseline emissions definition to clarify when historic actual emissions must be used rather than pre-project potential to emit, like potentially removing the clean emissions unit provision, explore retaining a modified fully offset emissions unit definition, and provision for units that have provided offsets for the full potential to emit within the past 5 years. So that would be for a given pollutant and emissions unit for which offsets have been provided within the 5-year period prior to the date that the application is deemed complete for the unit's full potential to emit. And additionally, we'll explore retaining the highly utilized emissions unit provision. Furthermore, we'll explore the emission offset exemptions, including but not limited to the exemption for emergency equipment. And then lastly, here today, the district is considering specifying provisions for calculating the unbanked shutdown emission reductions from a facility. In other words, will require that the emission reductions be actual emission reductions. And then we'll also explore the Clean Air Act section 182E2 offset provisions for extreme areas to allow the use of internal offsets at 1.3 to 1. And so with that, that concludes the Rule 2201 section. And I think at this point, we'll open up to any questions.
So as Jesse has just finished that portion, I did want to ask if any members of the public attending via Zoom had any questions, or those who are on teleconference, please press *9 to be recognized to speak. I don't see any questions via webcast just yet. And again, that email address is webcast@valleyair.org. And I'm looking to the
I do have a public comment, Lance Erickson.
Hey, good afternoon. How are you guys doing?
Doing great, Lance.
So my head is spinning after only the first few slides here. But I get the general drift. My question, and when it's kind of emphasized by the last bullet that's still up, the 1.3 to 1. For federal major modifications, what would the offset ratio be if you had a ton of emissions increase and you were offsetting from a different stationary source, you went out and bought them, how many tons of emissions would you have to provide?
So for the general federal major mod projects, it is a default of a 1.5 to 1 offset ratio that would be applied to those types of projects. And so the clean, I was going to say the Clean Air Act.
Regardless of distance, it's a different source. Even if it was right next door, it would be
Yes.
1.5 to 1. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And so the Clean Air Act, that section 182E2 does allow for, or has provisions for those extreme non-attainment areas if a facility is able to generate internal offsets, again, through that mechanism, that would allow for a 1.3 to 1 ratio instead of the default 1.5 to 1. So it's in the Clean Air Act. We're looking at thinking about including requirements that would allow for that provision to be utilized.
Appreciate that. So if I have been prudent and banked surplus NOx or VOC credits, and they're very clean, the offset ratio for a new ton of NOx would be 1.3 tons, even if it's from my own stationary source. Maybe, or it might be 1.5 to 1 if you don't do that.
Well, yeah. So the 1.3 to 1 provision has some specific requirements that need to be met, and so I don't think it's quite that simple. But we can talk offline and be able to understand kind of the requirements that would need to be met. I think they might have to be contemporaneous reductions. I'm not sure exactly what the language is off the top of my head, but again, the provision does exist, and we're looking to add that potential option to allow for the 1.3 to 1 ratio usage.
Yeah, I'll be interested to look into that. I wasn't. I do remember those numbers being kicked around, but it's been a while since I've read that part of the Clean Air Act. So, well, yeah, and I would certainly appreciate anything that can be done to reduce that offset ratio, because when you get into talking about NOx and VOC offsets a little later, they're going to be getting hard to find and fairly expensive.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lance. So we don't have any additional comments at this point. And again, as you come up with any potential questions, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or use the *9 function to make yourself known. We'll go ahead and move on to Brian Clerico, who will present on the proposed amendments to District Rule 2301.
Hi, thank you. I'm Brian Clerico, a supervising air quality engineer here in Permit Services. I'm going to speak today on some proposed amendments to Rule 2301, Emission Reduction Credit Banking. Emission reduction credits, or ERCs, are actual emission reductions. You'll see the abbreviation AER sometimes in this presentation. They're actual emission reductions in criteria pollutants, or greenhouse gases, that are recognized by the district for use as offsets or mitigation. And by criteria pollutants, I'm sure if you're at this meeting, many of you know that we generally mean NOx, VOC, PM10, PM2.5, SOx, and CO. ERC banking refers to the district system for quantifying, certifying, recording, and storing ERCs for future use or transfer. So the first topic here will be ERC application timeliness. For an emission reduction to become an ERC, it must meet certain eligibility criteria. The principal criteria, sometimes called the integrity criteria, are that the emission reduction be quantifiable, real, that they be surplus of all legal requirements. In other words, they're extra or early reductions, that those reductions be permanent, and that they be enforceable. And these criteria are universal to all ERC banking systems. Another criterion, though, however, for eligibility is that an ERC application be received in a timely manner. That's here, though that's not necessarily a universal requirement, but it is one here in the San Joaquin Valley. Application timeliness is, to be a timely application under the district's rule 2301, the application must be received within 180 days of the emission reduction occurrence. That's the term used, emission reduction occurrence. In its June 2020 report on the district's ERC banking system, CARB had flagged the ERC application timeliness as an issue for ERCs generated by shutdowns. But the district had also recognized this as a potential issue as far as back as the formation of the district in 1992, when it created a policy on interpretation of the definition of shutdown. This policy set forth a practical approach to address the potential lack of clarity in the rule. Among the amendments we're proposing here for 2301 is to incorporate that recommended shutdown definition from district policy. An emission reduction is eligible for banking in Rule 2301 if an application is submitted within 180 days of the emission reduction occurrence. To define when an emission reduction occurs, it's helpful to consider the types of permitting actions that could create an emission reduction, because those permitting actions have definite dates associated with them. Specifically, the permitting actions here or relevance to ERC application timeliness are implementation of authorities to construct, or ATCs, or cancellation of permits to operate. So for permitted sources, an emission reduction can come about through reducing emissions from a permitted source, for example, from voluntarily adding control equipment not required by law or regulation. This kind of reduction requires implementation of an ATC. And on the day an ATC is thus implemented, the emissions unit begins operating with reduced emissions. Thus, generally, the date of emission reduction or the occurrence of the emission reduction is the day the ATC is implemented. Similarly, where you have a shutdown or the permanent removal or cessation of operation of an emissions unit, that's accompanied by the surrender or cancellation of a permit to operate. Rule 2301 defines shutdown in section 3.14. The current Rule 2301 definition of shutdown is presented on this slide, and it's a lot of words, but it's worth, I think, going through this to see what the difficulties this definition creates. The definition has two parts. The first part defines shutdown, and it defines it as the earlier of the permanent cessation of emissions from an emitting unit, or the surrender of that, unit's operating permit. So you can see from this first part of this definition, the last emissions or cessation of emissions, that takes priority over PTO surrender, or appears to, in the way the language is given in this rule. The second part of the definition says, if prior to the surrender of the operating permit, the APCO determines that, and this is section 3.14.1, if the unit has been removed or fallen into an inoperable and unmaintained condition such that startup would require an investment exceeding 50% of the current replacement cost, and the owner cannot demonstrate to the satisfaction of the APCO that the owner intended to operate again, then the APCO may cancel the permit and deem the source shut down as of the date of last emissions. This is the second part of the definition here. I think you might see here a certain problem already in the definition and some opportunities here for clarification. First is as written, the first part of the definition and the second part are really difficult to reconcile. The first part implies that priority should be given to last emissions over PTO surrender for shutdowns. But then the second part kind of implies, well, doesn't kind of, it does imply the opposite reading there. It implies that the first part gives priority to PTO surrender over last emissions. The second part, the 3.14.1, 3.14.2, describe a contingency where the district should use date of last emissions over PTO surrender of a PTO. But those sections are really logically unnecessary because 3.14 already gives priority to last emissions. So that part doesn't really make sense internally, that definition. Section 3.14 also implies PTO surrender PTO of the permit to operate can legally occur before last emissions, but this would be a violation of Rule 2010. Since permitted sources cannot legally operate without a permit, then 3.14 would not allow any situation where surrender of a PTO is given priority over last emissions. But if this is the intention of the rule or the language, why mention PTO surrender at all? Another issue with this definition is that as written, the definition could be read to create an incentive to operate and to omit merely to extend application eligibility. And then another issue here is that the definition could be read to effectively eliminate seasonal sources from banking emission reductions. This is because if they operate less than year-round sources, they may not know if they're going to operate again come the following season, and if they don't, they've missed their window of opportunity to apply for ERCs. So, as a recommended language or amendment to the rule here, we are intending to use District Policy APR 1805, Policy on the Interpretation of the Definition of Shutdown. And this policy was adopted really from since the formation of the district in 1992 and has been used in practice since. And the next slide here has some draft rule language. The slide shows an attempt to integrate the policy, the language from that policy into the rule. The amended definition here would make a distinction between unpermitted and permitted sources, which would be helpful. And then similar to the current definition, the definition of shutdown for permitted sources will have two parts. The first part establishes the default date for shutdown as the surrender of the PTO. Then the second part of the definition, which is largely the same as the current rule, describes that contingency where the date of last emissions would be used instead. I'll note just parenthetically here that that part of that definition is truncated there on this slide. There was too much language to put on the slide, but in any event, the second part is essentially retains the current language in the rule. But we think incorporating this language from the policy resolves the clarity issues in the current version and produces a more coherent definition of shutdown, and moreover is consistent with longstanding district practice. So even with an amended definition of shutdown, the definition of what counts as a timely ERC application can be further clarified in the rule. You'll recall that in a timely application under 2301 is one that is received within 180 days of the emission reduction occurrence. But as discussed previously, this could be different depending on whether it is an ATC implementation or PTO surrender that creates the reduction. So with this slide here, it presents some of the key ideas in the recommended language we want to incorporate into the rule. So we want to, of course, mention actual emission reductions. We want to indicate when the emission reduction occurrence, what that date is for implementation of an ATC, and we also want to indicate, when this emission reduction occurrence is relative to the case of a shutdown, which is generally the default will be the date the PTO is surrendered. And here is some draft rule language related to that. You can see it. The language there is we're adding to the application timeliness to clarify really what when the emission reduction occurs. So the definition of AER is defined in 2301 and 2201. So we're using the abbreviation here, but I'll just quickly read through it here. Except for reductions covered under sections 4.1.2, and that section I'll just briefly mention is for ERCs created from reductions from before, I believe, 1998. And then section 4.5.4, which concerns greenhouse gas banking. So except for those two sections, an ER certificate application for reductions shall be submitted within 180 days after the emission reduction occurs. And then this goes on to define, okay, when is this date? When is, what dates are we comparing here? So for actual emission reductions resulting from implementation of an authority to construct permit, the date of emission reduction is the date the authority to construct permit was implemented. For actual emission reductions resulting from the permanent removal of an emissions unit with a permit to operate, the date of emission reduction is the date of shutdown as defined in 3.14. So those are the concepts we want to incorporate, something like that. This is very draft preliminary review language, but these are the concepts, and we want to, as much as possible, close any logical gaps in the rule that make it difficult to interpret. Another item we want to address with Rule 2301 is some kind of assessment on greenhouse gas banking going forward. And specifically, we want to evaluate the need for future banking of new greenhouse gas emission reductions. And a couple of considerations driving this are that greenhouse gas ERCs really have had minimal historical use since this was added to the rule in 2012. And then in addition, there's existence of alternative mature greenhouse gas banking programs. For example, CARB's compliance offset program within cap and trade, which came into existence roughly about the same time as the district's rule. So when the district adopted the greenhouse gas provision, there was no, there weren't many or any alternatives out there for sources. But now there are many sources or potential alternatives. And another consideration driving this is we don't really require use of greenhouse gas emission reduction credits. And the idea was they could be used by other entities for other purposes. But this also creates a problem when if they're used in ways we maybe don't necessarily think they should be used. And it creates a difficulty that we don't have with our I'll say criteria pollutant greenhouse gas banking actions, because we have full control over how those are issued and used. But we do welcome your input on this question. We want to hear your ideas about it. And then just in general, there are other amendments we would be considering for Rule 2301, and it would be just to revise as needed some of the administrative mechanisms or definitions and procedures for the banking and use of other kinds of creditable emission reductions. And that's from the unbanked shutdowns, air quality improvement deductions that we take for the 10% from new banking actions, and may include things like mobile source emission reduction credits, those sorts of topics we will address as well, or attempt to if they're appropriate for this rule. So with that, let's see. Should we go to questions or?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe this would be a good time to see if you have any questions or comments on anything that was discussed so far.
I do have a public comment from Lance Erickson.
Here we go again. Yeah, if my head was spinning on the new source review, it's really spinning on the banking. I did have one other comment on the new source review changes. It's something I want to, I have a concern about double jeopardy, if you will. We have recently submitted applications to comply with Rule 4306. And that's the only reason for submitting the applications, is to comply with the district prohibitory rule. But we've been requested to supply the information necessary to calculate emissions under the new source review rule. And I'm not 100% sure the calculations would show that you need to do anything, but I'm not 100% sure that they wouldn't. It depends. There's a lot of it depends on what you accept and what you'd require under the new source review rule, which can get quite complicated. And then it would be subject to a public review period as well, where you could get comments from people that are less involved with the actual process of reducing emissions from prohibitory rules. So bottom line, you've got to come up with a way of putting prohibitory rules into effect without subjecting them to new source review. And so that's a concern I have with the way the current rule is being interpreted. And I don't think it'll change. I'm not sure so that may be an interpretation question of the current rule, or it may be a comment that you need to look at making it clearer as to how air quality improvement projects or projects, just simply projects to comply with prohibitory rules, are handled. For this project in question, I'm being asked, technically I'm having to supply 10 years worth of data, annual data for 5 pollutants for 180 units, approximately 172, I think. Just an incredible amount of data. You're going to charge me to evaluate all that as well. So I think that so the comment is handling of projects that are under new source would not be subject to new source review because they're to comply with a district prohibitory rule.
Yeah, hey, Lance, this is Errol again. Thank you for that comment. Yeah, that's definitely something that we can put into consideration. The reason why we are asking that is because the interpretation of the current rule is how we understand the requirements to be. But I understand the concern associated with, especially a large project like that, 170, 180 units. But we can definitely talk a little bit more details. Again, there's no current exemptions associated with what these were referred to as historically pollution control projects. But it's something that we can talk offline and see if that's something that is potentially be able to be included as part of our 2201 amendments. But it is consistent with our interpretation of federal requirements today based on the current the way the rule is currently written.
Well, yeah, I can understand that, but that's what I call double jeopardy. We're applying only to we've applied only because the district made a change to its rules. But in fact, by the way the district's rules are set up, as you just described, we could have to do something more when we're not doing anything except lowering emissions. So I appreciate you looking into that, and we definitely will need to talk about how you're going to address those in the future, especially the rules coming up that with additional rules coming up where you've inserted into the prohibitory rule a requirement to submit an authority to construct. Perhaps there's an administrative mechanism that can be used. Anyway, I'll try and get off that soapbox here. So, just to the banking rule real quick. In reading the rules, number one, there's on pages 19 and 20, we use the words removal of a permitted source, but then we talk about an emissions unit. I think I wanted to request that if we're talking about the same thing, but we use the same words everywhere, and I believe the words you're looking for are emission unit. Although the current rule may say source somewhere. Source is a very confusing word, especially in federal interpretations, where it can mean either a stationary source or a source operation. So if we're talking about emissions unit, make sure the word you use is emissions unit. So as far as 180 days goes, and I know how it works under the current rule and under the current policy, but in reading the changes, it kind of looks like I have to surrender my permit, and then within 180 days of surrendering the permit, apply for the banking credits. And I'm not sure that's the intent. Can you address, is that actually the intent, or is the intent to do it the way we've always done it?
So that isn't the way you've always done it. Yeah, my understanding. I'm sorry, Lance. What?
So I've got a piece of equipment that we've been operating. We're happy, but for whatever reason, we've decided we're no longer need that piece of equipment. We've shut it down, and there's a clock that starts somewhere that you have the 180 days. And the way it's worked now is I turn in an application so long as I still have the permit, and then I go and calculate the emissions based on 2201, 2 out of the last 5 years, 2 years prior, or 2 out of the last 5 years. But then when you're ready to issue the certificates, I have to I have to surrender the permit prior to issuance to make them permanent. So it's not a timing issue, it's a calculational issue, the way I've been doing it for the last 30 years, since 1992.
Well, let's see, the rule does say in two different places, there's the application timeliness, the 180 days. One says after 180 days, one says within 180 days, sort of implying on either side of that
Yeah.
surrender.
Yeah, and so I'd like it to say no later than 180 days of permit surrender. That allows me to turn it in now, and here's the trick, and I want to keep this in the forefront, that I don't know if I'm going to be permanently in surrendering that permit to operate, but I know I can't get any credits until I do, because the credits don't become permanent until you surrender the permit to operate. But I can apply for them, and the clock for calculations begins when I apply. And if that's not the way it's working, I'm pretty sure it's pretty close to the way it's working. Because the calculations are based on when you apply for the credits and have the complete application for the credits submitted, and that doesn't really require the surrender of the permit. So by changing it, I don't want to lose that ability to have some flexibility on the credits you can get, because again, credits, especially surplus credits, are going to be hard to get in the future.
Right.
I don't want to reduce the amount of available surplus credits by a snafu in how we write a rule. That's what I'm really looking at. So I think we need to carefully examine that to keep it flexible and not require surrender of a permit to operate before you apply for credits.
Right, the baseline date is tied to the application, the baseline, determination. So that's something I think that's an issue too. I think you're raising.
Right, but and I don't want I don't mind that. That's fine. The baseline can be tied to, it should be tied to the date of application. It's just I don't want to have to surrender that permit, make the decision that I have to surrender the permit, because sometimes it takes you a year to decide whether you're going to really start something up or not. But if I have to wait that year to submit my application and then surrender the permit, I'm not. I've lost an amount of credit by the way the calculations work, and I don't want to lose that credit because people aren't 100% sure what they're going to do the minute they shut down a piece of equipment. They're not going to say, "Oh man, I could get a bunch of credits by shutting this down. I better shut it down and turn in the application right away." They're more likely to shut it down and say, well, a year from now, we're not going to start operating again. But maybe we should turn in the permit and get some credits. By that time, you've lost a significant fraction, maybe 20% of your available credits. Just so while the surrender of the permit works as far as applying prior to surrender of the permit, I want to keep that open and keep that flexible.
Hey, Lance, this is Errol again. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that comment. We will look at, I guess, the way to interpret that. We don't intend to change that requirement the way you have, like you said, historically submitted ERC applications, and as far as submitting it before the surrender of the permit, we'll take a look at that language and make sure that the intent is clear. What we were trying to do, at least with the proposed recommendations, is get into or away from the misinterpretation of those submittals that had the potential of trying to figure out whether or not we were looking at the date of cessation as the shutdown date or the surrender of the permit. That was our main intent on revising the requirements in 2301, but we don't intend to change that aspect as far as the need to surrender a permit prior to an ERC application, but we'll look into that and work with you.
Those are exact words I wanted to hear. Thank you. If they still are confusing, I'll make written comments along the line somewhere. But it sounds like you want to make it work the first time, so I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, written comments are always appreciated. So that way we can have maybe a formal response to those types of questions or comments. But thank you for the comment.
And another comment is we're introducing, and this is, I'm shifting gears now, so you can drop the last one. One of the words that we talk about is used is implement the authority to construct. And that's a concept that we struggle with from time to time because we get an authority to construct, to add control. We add the controls, we begin operating under the controls, but may or may not immediately meet the control requirement. There may be a source test required. So at some point, the permit to operate gets issued for those controls. But anywhere along that, somewhere along that timeline from when you start building the change to the final permit being issued is implemented. And maybe I don't mind the term being used undefined, but we need to come up with an understanding of what's expected. But because it is difficult sometimes to say when an authority to construct was actually implemented, when you started operating under it. And I don't want to really change the procedures with the district because they're fairly flexible right now in how that works. But it's a term that you put it in the rule now, so you have to be a little careful and come to an understanding of how that's used.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Point taken, and we'll take a careful read and yeah, I do see your point in regards to the difficulties in making that quote unquote determination of implementation date.
And yeah, okay, shifting gears again, appreciate that. And we'll see how the language comes out where I can actually read through, and perhaps some examples, an example or two might be helpful. As we used to use the donut fryer as the example. So somebody shut down their donut fryer and turned in an application, or put controls on their donut fryer, what would they have to do? So maybe some type of example that doesn't really commit to a specific type of industry would be helpful. I'm gonna wait till I see the rest of the rules, but I'm on the GHG credits. There's not a lot. I don't think there's much ability to generate credits from sources that are in cap and trade programs anyway, the way the rule's written. Am I correct in that regard? If you're in cap and trade, you can't generate any new credits for greenhouse gases already, is my understanding.
Yes, that's right. That's my understanding as well.
So what if we, and I don't see any big deal with so it would be non-cap and trade people would be able to generate credits, and that doesn't affect me, so maybe I don't really care. But I'm wondering why there's a concern about greenhouse gas credits at all. It seems like they're fairly equitably addressed already. So I'm just wondering why those changes are being considered.
So as we're going through the potential amendments to the 2201 and 2301, we're just trying to make, I guess, concessions for making the rule a little bit more simple. As the slides that Brian had presented, we haven't seen historically a large usage of that GHG banking provision. Like you said, the majority, all of the greenhouse gas or cap and trade sources aren't able to bank GHGs. And so in just finding ways to allow for or clean up the language, moving that our agency is mainly focused on the criteria pollutants. It was something that we added when there were no banking opportunities for GHGs, but there are the various banks that do exist now. And so we just, again, at this point, it was a recommendation, but we do want to hear potential comments and or suggestions on whether or not it should be kept or it should wouldn't be an issue for us to get rid of those provisions to allow for the banking of GHGs.
Sure. It's when the GHG banking section was included, we were encouraged to, in many ways, to bank the credits we could because there was a window to bank those credits, and then they could be. Then the use of those credits was unclear. And I agree with you there. What the value of a greenhouse gas credit is, I can't tell you that. I believe Chevron is one of the larger holders of greenhouse gas credits, and I would not like to see those be eliminated, or their use restricted in some way that, because their use really isn't clearly defined anyway. As I mentioned, they're not going to be used in a cap, and you mentioned they're not going to be used in cap and trade. There's a completely different program for that.
Yeah, and so the intent, as far as the proposed amendments, would not remove or get rid of existing GHG credits or limit the usage of them at this point. It was to remove the language that would that had discussions for generating or allowing the banking of new GHG credits.
Okay, that's good to hear. That's what I wanted to hear. I don't really know if the greenhouse gas credits have any value today, but in the past, I've made some guesses at what's going to happen in the future, and and I've been wrong. So some things have had value that I thought would not have value, and other things that I thought would have value have not. So I appreciate that change. Just if you remove the ability to bank new credits, that's and doesn't discount or remove any ability to use bank credits already, that should be okay. So I'm going to put my hand down now, see if anybody else wants to talk.
No problem. Thank you so much for the comments, Lance. Do we have? Okay. So I am looking at our team here in the room, and it doesn't look like there are any additional public comments at this point. I have just rechecked the webcast email, and I don't see any webcast comments or emails in our webcast at valleyair.org. Nothing on the teleconference lines that we've been notified of. So if we can go ahead and go back to the next steps slide. All right, so again, so this slide is presenting the next steps as far as the public engagement process for rules 2201 and 2301 and our proposed amendments. We held a scoping meeting back on April 15th. We will be holding a number of public workshops. This is the first, again, June 29th is today's date. We are moving forward with proposed amendments. We will be scheduling and hopefully publishing a date for the upcoming workshops. At that point, after the workshops have been done, we will publish a proposed rule. And the goal is to take the rule amendments of 2201 and 2301 to our governing board either late this year or more likely early 2023. And of course, throughout this process, we invite the public to submit comments and participate through these workshops and meetings. So we really do appreciate those who have been in attendance tonight. And again, of course, Lance, for your verbal comments that we've received. Last slide, is there contact? No? Okay, so I think that was it. So I will open it up one last time. Any additional comments or questions from?
I have a Scott Falkenberg.
Okay.
There we go. Hey, I just had one comment on the greenhouse gas credits. We do use them with for various public agencies as well as for ESG reporting. So I do want to see that stay in there, and that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you, Scott. All right. Seeing no other comments, actually perfect timing. It is 6:30. I will go ahead and adjourn and close the public workshop for this evening. Thank you once again for joining us and have a great rest of your night. Thank you, everyone.